Okay, welcome to Chapter 11, Part 2, Strategic Cost Management. We covered essentially pricing strategies of suppliers and how not to be jibbed and to have a fair relationship and transaction with suppliers in terms of pricing. But that's not all that cost management in purchasing is about. There are also what we call hedging tools. It's basically the equivalent of insurance policies for the future. Hedging is basically defending your position. There are three types of hedging tools that the book talks about. We'll stay with those. These are considered call options, collars, which are basically on both sides of the equation in terms of buy and sell pricing, and also fixed price swaps. The intent with this chapter, given the fact that we're barely covering some of these strategies, isn't for you to become an expert on it, rather just to have a sense of what these strategies can do for the organization. So in terms of call options, recognize that it's basically calling to the future and say reserving your right to purchase something down the line. So call options are the equivalent of, let's say, what Southwest Airlines did by requesting the option of purchasing some fuel at a lower price somewhere down in the future, which actually became a competitive advantage for them back when the oil prices were significantly high. Now, call options are just like buying bank insurance, right? The downside to call options, they're not downside as part of the process. They basically require specific upfront costs, so that's something to consider. Call options require a ceiling price to be established. This is how much I'm going to pay and no more in the future. And they also allow for downside price participation. So if the price drops significantly, we can certainly use that call option for the purpose. Now, callers are basically sell and buy, or buy and put options for the future. They don't really have any upfront costs at the beginning often. But the upside cost is capped through a ceiling, and also the downside is set as a floor. So we have a ceiling and a floor for collars. And then in terms of fixed price swaps, this basically means that we're going to change a price from now to the future. They do provide full protection from higher prices in the future, but they don't have offer the ability to participate in price decreases. So some general ideas about how hedging tools apply. Let's go through a couple of these very quickly, just so that you get a sense of how these hedging tools are used to benefit the firm. Again, the intent isn't for you to become an expert, rather just to understand some of the basics. Let's say that we have a commodity, in this case is dotted green, so let's say it is hemp, right? And that commodity is actually rising in price, or it's expected to go higher and higher. And so a smart purchasing manager says, you know what, I'm not going to deal with this size of a price increase. I'm going to try and hedge my bets. So instead of paying let's say $48, they pay a premium at the beginning and put a hedge for $50, and buy it in advance. Now, no matter when or where the price goes in the future, they have a fixed hedge price at $50. So if suddenly the price goes up to $68, they can exercise the right to purchase that at $50, which can become quite important from a purchasing standpoint. Now, these are exercise rights. They don't have to use it. They have simply paid the premium to exercise it as well. Now, in terms of buying a call option, it's a little different. And again, we have this green stuff that is moving up, and we pay a slight premium in this case. and we have the option to use a price, a particular price, at any time in the future as well, and but not beyond that at all. So that becomes another way of a call option. Callers is when we basically have the option to put and call in the future. Now, let's say that we are at this point in time and the customer says, you know what, the price of this green stuff is going up. I want to hedge my bets, and so I'm going to place a put strike at some time in the future when the price goes up to a certain level, and with the idea that if I buy it, then down the line it's going to save me money, right? So nothing gets purchased or transaction gets done at that moment in time. The put strike is done in the future, and then if the price goes up, then they can actually call that put, and that becomes a benefit for the customer. You see, so in other words, as the price goes up, they save. Let me go back to these and clarify a couple of things that I probably didn't mention the correct way. At this point in time, we just simply reserve the right to do so. Once the price hits a strike level that we want to deal with, then we put our money in and we buy it. At a point in time in the future, then we can exercise it. It could be months, years afterwards, but by doing so, we save a lot more. We save by not necessarily having to buy it. Same thing here is that we have a exercise right at this point in time to purchase at this level, and we buy it at that level later on in the future. Okay, so that's a very, very quick and dirty lesson on hedging. What you probably want to remember is that different options have different benefits, and sometimes, depending on the type of commodity we're dealing with, collars, fixed price swaps, or call options may be necessary. Okay, let's talk about the things that suppliers may provide as a way to incentivize the buyer to either pay invoices promptly, or perhaps this is what we want to look for. One of the key ones that you probably will have a question on the exam about is this notion of 210 versus net 30. I'm going to reserve on explaining this because I want to make sure that you read the book as well. And so go ahead and start a discussion thread explaining what the difference is between 210 and net 30 and what are the benefits of each. It is usually worthwhile for buyers to take advantage of cash discounts, but that, of course, is if we have the money, right? So big buyers usually benefit from it more than small buyers because small buyers really have to pay close attention to their cash flow. But nevertheless, cash discounts are a high return item. Next item on the agenda is PPI, Producer Price Index, as opposed to CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, and that is where price is largely a function of supply and demand. Again, we're talking about cocoa and coffee, gold, copper, you name it, large-scale global items. Oftentimes, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is who generates these numbers for the United States for Producer Price Index, and it basically tracks material price movements on a quarter-to-quarter basis. So oftentimes, buyers pay close attention to where that is, and depending on the results or the trends, they tend to purchase or put their purchasing efforts into one commodity or the other. So for instance, in this case, if the index is at 100 and is staying at 100 but it's moving up, the company has purchased more than enough at the beginning quarter and doesn't necessarily need as much, and while it's going up, they can replenish or use some of the inventory that they have, and therefore save on costs. But of course, carrying inventory and using it, there's a lot of trade-off in between, and when we deal with just-in-time, the issue of managing inventory becomes another concern by itself. So that's something that is a trade-off for purchasing managers to keep in mind. Um, so next we want to talk about some of the cost analysis, some of the techniques that we have for cost analysis. And so we talk about cost-based pricing models, product specs, reverse price analysis, and particularly with break-even analysis. The first one, actually, let me mention this slide. Cost-based pricing models look at how prices are made with a markup included. Margin pricing models, of course, if it's based on profit margins, and rate of return pricing models depend on the desired profit and financial investment of the supplier. So, for instance, a cost markup pricing, fairly straightforward, that let's say that the supplier wants a 20% markup on its $50 item. So the item is $50 to produce, a 20% markup off of the $50, which is basically $10, means that the price that they're going to charge us is $60, 50 plus 10. Margin pricing is a little different, right? Let's say that we want a 20% profit margin on the sales price, but now we're dealing with margin. $50 total cost, and then the cost divided by 1 minus the margin rate becomes the unit selling price. And so in this case, 100 minus 20% is 80%, and 50 divided by the 0.8 ends up being 62.5. So in other words, let me make sure that you understand this. This is 50 divided by 80%, or 50 divided by 0.80, which is equal to 62.50. So you see the difference between margin pricing and markup pricing. And then we have rate of return pricing example, in which case, again, the 20% return on investment is needed, but that depends on the amount of investment that they need to make. So if they invest $300,000 to produce 4,000 units, right, and the cost per unit is $50, then we need to add the return of pricing into the equation here, which is 20% of their $300,000. That's their optimal goal, divided by 4,000. So this whole entire red, which I'm going to change to green, becomes their rate of return calculation, and that gets to be included alongside with the price, right? So this is where they want to make sure that they get their money, 20% of the 300 grand on a per unit basis, and so that becomes essentially $15, right? 50 plus $15, which is equal to $65, right? So ROR pricing, margin pricing, and cost markup pricing give you a different result. Depending on specification, if we go after product specifications, then there's customization of design and tooling, which increases the prices as well. Whereas standardized components are less expensive, customization adds quite a bit to the price of the good. In terms of cost analysis, we can look at the details and components in each step of the process by which the supplier makes the item that they are creating for us. And so it's a direct function of quality and availability of the information. The techniques that we use here is to detail the production cost breakdowns, and this also requires quite a bit of sharing of cost information between the two. Remember, this detailed cost analysis we want to do for the strategic items and the critical items that we have, because it takes a lot of time and effort. So let's see. Reverse price analysis is essentially the same, very similar to reverse engineering, if you want to think of it that way. We break it down and figure out how much the cost should be, right? A sub sandwich We know the price of the bread, we know the price of mayo, we know the price of lettuce, tomatoes, and salami that goes into it. We know the labor cost associated with making a sub sandwich, so we should be able to figure out how much that the cost of the item is. So, and we break down the cost into the basic components. So we can actually do internal engineering estimates. We can break down the cell phone, we can break down the cars, and we can also use our historical judgment and experience to figure out what the learning curve has been, and you can also use public financial statements in that regard. Let's take a look at an example of a reverse price analysis. These are kind of fun to look at. Let's say that a hypothetical price for take an item, a cordless phone is $20. And we know that generally speaking, the profit and sales general administrative costs are about 15%, so that becomes $3 per unit. So the subtotal becomes $17. We also know that the material that's used in this cordless phone is about $4. So now we have subtotal of $13 that is used for everything else. So the direct labor is $3 because we can figure out how quickly this cordless phone on a 1,000 production rate can be, and so now we realize that the manufacturing burden or overhead is $10. Ha ha ha! This is quite an expensive proposition, right? To have the overhead at $10 seems a little too high. So that kind of gives us a sense to go back to the supplier and say, look, you're charging me too much. Is it your manufacturing manager or your chief operating officer that's making too much of a salary? So next we get into break-even analysis. And break-even analysis is a very powerful tool to assess the profitability given the supplier's cost structure. Really, if you have a huge amount of fixed cost, and even if your variable costs are low, or if you have low fixed cost and high variable costs, those determine the cost structure, and so break-even analysis can become quite handy there. It also helps to better understand the supplier's cost structure. But before I get into some of the assumptions behind break-even analysis, I thought I found an animated script that can help us better understand some of the basics first. So let's take a look at this little video, and we can then move forward with some of the assumptions.
With volume increasing on the x-axis, you can see that the fixed costs don't change depending on the volume. After all, it is fixed. Some examples of fixed costs are lease costs, rent, and insurance. The fixed costs are shown at the point where the total cost line crosses the y-axis. On the other hand, variable costs such as labor, materials, and supplies are costs that change with the volume of production. The total variable cost is the variable cost per unit. In other words, how much we are spending in labor and material cost for each unit that we are producing. Multiply by how many units we sell, and that's our total variable cost. If we plug in the variable cost on top of the fixed costs, we get the total cost line. Our total cost is, therefore, the sum of the fixed costs plus the total variable costs. We have a line that has a positive slope, and it starts out at what the fixed costs are and goes up from there. Now we look at the total revenue line on the chart. The total revenue is a function of the units sold. It is a function of our selling price per unit times the number of units sold. You can see that when we sold no units, we don't have any revenue, so we're at zero. But we go up with a line that has a slope equal to the selling price of the product. Break-even volume is what I want to talk about now. The break-even volume is a specific number, and it refers to the number of units that you need to sell so that the total revenue equals total cost. Where the total revenue and total cost lines intersect is the break-even point, and the volume there is called the break-even volume. And this is a very important concept. Most companies will know what their break-even volume is, because they know until they hit that point, they don't have a profit. If your actual volume is greater than the break-even volume, then you have a profit. Now we're looking to the left of the break-even point, area shaded in red. Here we didn't generate enough revenue to take care of our costs. If your actual volume is less than the break-even volume, then it means that you're not selling enough to cover your expenses. So you have a loss. Let's take a closer look at what break-even analysis is telling us. Suppose the management develops a new process, layout, or selection of new equipment that reduces fixed costs for the company. Profit is increased by the amount of savings on the fixed costs. On the break-even chart, a reduced fixed cost lowers the total cost line, which results in increased profits to the company. But in addition to that, you will notice that break-even point is lowered. When the management is able to reduce these fixed costs for the company, they have a very direct impact on the profitability of the company and on how soon they begin making profit by lowering the break-even. Next, we will decrease the variable cost per unit. Suppose the management is able to reduce material and labor costs for each unit produced. The savings are realized now for each unit sold. For example, if you're able to figure out how to make parts with less time or less material, you are in this category. The slope of the variable cost line decreases if we decrease the variable cost, and so the break-even point is reduced, and our fixed costs are recovered sooner and profits are increased. What if we are able to increase the selling price per unit? Raising the selling price without lowering volume increases profit. Here our total cost line is the same, but our total revenue line is higher because the selling price per unit is higher. So at the same selling volume X, we are making more profit. Again, in this case, the break-even volume is reduced. Break-even analysis is a powerful.
Good. I thought this was a pretty nice little clip about break-even analysis. Some of the assumptions behind break-even analysis is that we consider fixed costs to be constant all the way through the volumes, but fixed costs don't have to be constant, just like our fuel costs, for instance. It can vary in electricity, or leasing of buildings can be higher or lower. And we also assume that variable costs fluctuate in a linear fashion, but they don't necessarily have to do that. In other words, variable costs can be exponential and rise quite a bit more than just linearly. Revenues can directly vary with volume, and fixed and variable costs may include semi-variable. Semi-variable costs, if you're not familiar with it, semi-variable costs are the same, are the equivalent of something that you pay a down payment over, and then which is fixed, but then the rest of it can be variable. Kind of like how you use your cell phone. If you go over a certain number of minutes used, then they charge you significantly more, even though you have a baseline number of minutes to use. The other issues with break-even analysis in terms of assumptions is that it considers total cost rather than average cost, and it only considers quantitative factors. So the subjective aspect of how increase in capacity may have is different. Nevertheless, I think the gentleman did a pretty good job of explaining how break-even point and the profits and losses on either side it can play a role. So. The next item on the agenda for this lecture is on TCO, and but I'm going to save this for the second part of chapter 11. So we're going to pause here and come back and talk about TCO in the next part. So let's consider this the end of chapter 11, part 2, with one more section to go.